How do you get a gender theory article published? That's my subject on today's Fiamengo File. I'm Janice Fiamengo of the University of Ottawa, and recently 2 authors calling themselves Peter Boyle and Jamie Lindsay published an academic spoof of feminist man-hating called The Conceptual Penis as a Social Construct. May not be quite in the league of classic academic hoaxes like physics professor Alan Sokal's piece in the prestigious journal Social Texts, which claimed that quantum gravity was a linguistic construct, or J.T. Dillon's marvelous essay in the reputable journal American Psychologist on the emergence of the colon, punctuation mark, not the internal organ, as a sign of academic authority in titles of academic articles. The conceptual penis argued in overblown post-structuralist feminist psychobabble that we should stop thinking of the penis as a male reproductive organ and instead understand it as an expression of what else? Toxic masculinity, implicated with rape, both literal and metaphorical, and needing to be rethought in ways less damaging to women and the environment. It's a delightful spoof of feminist man-hatred. The problem is, according to a number of critics, that Cogent Social Sciences, the journal that published The Conceptual Penis, requires authors to pay a fee to be published there. In other words, it's not a top-tier peer-reviewed journal. According to these critics, then, the article's publication doesn't prove that the field of gender studies in general is corrupt and nonsensical. Okay, that's fine, but that isn't the real issue. I don't require the article's publication to prove that gender studies is corrupt. There's plenty of evidence for that within gender studies itself. The interesting point about this story is that anyone familiar with gender theory should be able to see that the actual difference between the conceptual penis and many highly respected gender theory articles and books is a matter of degree only. In fact, as I'm going to show, some famous gender theorists, such as Judith Butler, write in a manner hardly less overheated and illogical than our 2 would-be hoaxers. The conceptual penis should actually be read as a pastiche of academically fashionable ideas and as a not unreliable how-to guide for writing a feminist theoretical essay on masculinity. Let's consider the abstract of the paper as a model for the typical gender studies approach. Here it is, quote, "Anatomical penises may exist, but as preoperative transgendered women also have anatomical penises, the penis, vis-a-vis maleness, is an incoherent construct. We argue that the conceptual penis is better understood not as an anatomical organ, but as a social construct, isomorphic to performative toxic masculinity. Through detailed post-structuralist discursive criticism and the example of climate change, this paper will challenge the prevailing and damaging social trope that penises are best understood as the male sexual organ and reassign it a more fitting role as a type of masculine performance." End quote. So, what does this abstract tell us about how to get a gender theory paper published in an academic journal? Well, first, of course, you start with a corrosive contempt for masculinity, but that goes without saying. Then you add the terminology and verbal habits of gender theory. To reverse George Orwell, never use a single syllable or common word if a multisyllabic word will do, especially a foreign, scientific, or technical sounding word. So vis-a-vis is much better than in relation to. Isomorphic is a heck of a lot sexier than something like corresponding with. And trope, though it is single syllable, is still an impressively obscure piece of post-structuralist lingo that can conveniently be substituted for a word like idea. If you're in need of an all-purpose noun to stand in for a word like thing, reach for construct, or even better, social construct. Construct also happens to function very nicely as a verb, especially in the passive voice, as in is constructed. If you're in doubt about an adjective to put before masculinity, of course, toxic is a pretty good bet, though personally I prefer hegemonic, which is not only multisyllabic and redolent of the left bank, but also evocatively Marxist intellectual. Now, once you've got the lingo down, and really it doesn't take long to master it, now tackle gender theory shadowboxing with fact and logic. In other words, if you're forced to acknowledge a biological fact or widely accepted social reality, do so in a doubting or insouciant manner, with a kind of verbal shrug, as in the opening line of the abstract, anatomical penises may exist. That's just the right amount of smirk. Something similar occurs in the body of the article, where the term male is put in quotation marks as if to highlight that the word is, in the Derridian sense, under erasure. In other words, it continues to operate as a word, but its metaphysical underpinning has been radically undermined. The article makes inconsequential points, such as that a pre-op transgender woman still has a penis, or that some men choose not to reproduce or are infertile, as proof that the penis has a, quote, incoherent relationship to maleness, though those instances are not proof of that at all. The basic rule is never let historical fact, scientific evidence, or basic logic get in the way of your feminist genderqueer utopianism. And finally, perhaps most importantly of all, you must cite the correct gender theory superstars, even if their work has little or nothing to do with your argument. The authors here have this down to a T. They refer, for example, to discursive criticism as their methodology, thus evoking French theorist Michel Foucault, the idiosyncratic gay godfather of modern gender theory, perhaps one of the most cited and least understood of theoretical forefathers, and someone with almost zero interest, ironically, in women's issues, and someone who, as far as I understand it, would never have called masculinity toxic. But never mind. In his The History of Sexuality, Volume 1, first published in 1976, Foucault developed the idea that our language and systems of knowledge do not describe a pre-existent truth or reality, but rather constitute or construct it. From Foucault's contention that homosexuality was invented in the 18th and 19th centuries, feminists derived their foundational premise that femininity and masculinity are also inventions. Foucault would almost certainly have found most feminist ideas of male power risibly simplistic, but he's still a quotable expert for feminists on discourse. And an even more revered authority is Foucault's American disciple Judith Butler, the butch queen of gender theory, who in her 1990 book, Gender Trouble, first developed the idea of gender as performance, as a process, always incomplete, never stable or unalterable. It's safe to say that very few theorists, perhaps not even Butler herself, fully understand what she meant by that. Her own statement of the core idea is, I think, pretty facile. Here it is. It's a little bit long, but hang in there. Quote, "If gender is the cultural meanings that the sexed body assumes, then a gender cannot be said to follow from a sex in any one way. Taken to its logical limit, the sex-gender distinction suggests a radical discontinuity between sexed bodies and culturally constructed genders. Assuming for the moment the stability of binary sex," she's going to undermine that too, "it does not follow that the construction of men will accrue exclusively to the bodies of males, or that women will interpret only female bodies. Further, even if the sexes appear to be unproblematically binary in their morphology and constitution, which will become a question, there is no reason to assume that genders ought also to remain as two. When the constructed status of gender is theorized as radically independent of sex, gender itself becomes a free-floating artifice, with the consequence that man and masculine might just as easily signify a female body as a male one, and woman and feminine a male body as easily as a female one. End quote. So I won't belabor the implications of this, which are fairly obvious, except to note that Butler's second sentence about the, quote, radical discontinuity between sexed bodies and culturally constructed genders, end quote, doesn't follow from her first sentence about gender as, quote, the cultural meanings that the sexed body assumes, end quote. Just because culture shapes gender doesn't mean it shapes it from nothing or in arbitrary ways. And to be fair to Butler, who's certainly no dummy, she spent her next book, Bodies That Matter, trying to clarify what she meant, recognizing how problematic it was. But many academics took the original statement as gospel, biologically and anthropologically flimsy as it was, and in feminist hands, the idea of gender performance became a predictable paradigm for demonizing heterosexual masculinity and romanticizing gender transgression. And the authors of The Conceptual Penis have perfected a Foucaultian Butlerian style that is all too familiar to those of us who've read gender theory over the past 25 years. Here's a game to play with your gender studies friends. Open up a piece of writing by someone influenced by Foucault and Butler and lay it beside The Conceptual Penis. Read a passage from each and ask your friend to tell you which is the real theory paper, which the parody. Want to try it? Close your eyes if you don't want to see the sources identified on the screen and see if you can guess. Here we go. Number 1. This paper addresses masculinity as a negotiated system of identities that are accomplished through the ritual display of phallic attributes. Number 2. So we are reminded again that masculinity, indeed all gender, is always incomplete, but in a constant dialectic, shifting in different fields and established temporarily and evasively. Number 3. The male sex is socially constructed. It is a political entity that flourishes only through acts of force and sexual terrorism. Number 4. The result of this trichotomy of roles is to place hyper-masculine men both within and outside of competing discourses whose dynamics, as seen via post-structuralist discourse analysis, enact a systematic interplay of power. And 5. In addition to articulating the phallus as a temporal concept in its traditional psychoanalytic formulation, this book tracks alternative temporalities where one could move from castration to phallus, as well as in the other direction, where the lost phallus is surprisingly regained, or where the phallus might appear not only in the past but as a promising future. These alternatives participate in the promise of queer temporality and may even lead to queerer phalluses and less anxious castrations. So, which one is the fake? You tell me.
Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please support us on Patreon. If even half of our subscribers gave us $1 per month, we'd be well on our way to creating more and better content. And don't forget to subscribe to us on Studio Brule.